Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red, joined as always by Nizar Hassan. Nizar, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. We've got quite a bit to cover today, and we've got a very good guest with us today, the co-founder of Megaphone, Jean Kassir. Jean, welcome to the show. Really great to have you.
Thank you.
And this week we're going to be talking about the media with you, Jean. And we're doing this, of course, as a part of that, right? So we might have to be a little bit self-critical as well. We all of us, we're involved in the Lebanese Politics Podcast, but also we either work or have worked in the media sector before. But I think that we're going to have a very interesting conversation about just the state of the sector right now, the challenges facing it, and sort of the issues that we need to overcome within the sector. But first off, we have to get to the news. Coronavirus. We actually have good news this week. Cases are actually down. Now they're not down to like 2020 levels or anything like that, but the average number of new cases per day, if you look at the 7-day moving average, is down to about 2,500 now, which is much better. You look back a couple of weeks ago, it was at 3,100 roughly. So that is trending in the right direction. And another thing that is very key here is that ICU numbers are also down. So right now, according to the latest numbers from the health ministry, which was just last night, we're recording this on Sunday, so Saturday night, the health ministry said there were 864 people in ICU. That is down from the high. I mean, you remember the high, it almost reached 1,000 people in intensive care units. So that is good, but sort of like with the number of cases where we're not, like back to normal, we're not back to a place where everybody can totally relax. 864 cases, that's still roughly 4 and 5 beds full. So we're still pretty high on that count, but things are going in the right direction for right now, at very least. And one of the reasons for this drop in ICU numbers, or at least one of the things that's been credited, is just these vaccinations and the fact that older people who might need intensive care more, they've been at the front of the line in terms of vaccination. So hopefully we are seeing, yes, there are lots of problems with everything that has gone on with the response to the pandemic here, but at least right now, some things are going right, and we're seeing some gains. And this week as well, we have Ramadan starting at the beginning of the week. And with that comes another sort of lockdown. We're going to have a curfew starting at 9:30 p.m. until 5 a.m. And so even though Lebanon has opened back up, it's quite clear authorities have their eye on this, which is good. And they are trying to put in place some measures so that things don't get out of control like they did over the Christmas and New Year's holidays.
Yeah, it seems, I don't know if you guys share this sentiment. It seems to me that we've kind of accepted coronavirus in a way or another as like, as a restriction to our lifestyle, etc. in Lebanon, much more than the early days. Even when the measures are not as strict, I feel like there has been some kind of community adjustment to the new rules, and in my opinion, this is related obviously to the experience that people had with the pandemic and losing people around them, etc. But I don't know. It feels like not only the state is managing it better, but also communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, that's the key part here. Authorities can say whatever they want, but the question is, will they take this to heart? Will they modify their behavior? And it seems as though a lot of people actually are.
Indeed. On another front, this week we had a press conference on Friday where German companies, supported obviously by the German state, presented a reconstruction plan for the port of Beirut following the explosion. So this is one of the big investment spots in Lebanon where there's been a lot of talks in the political sphere around who's going to be funding the port reconstruction and who's going to be kind of which state, which European country or etc., will be taking over this project as a central project, the most like urgent and large scale investment project in Lebanon that involves the state and the private sector, etc. And the Germans have been have pushed in on this. And on Friday, we were presented with a plan that includes several possible proposals, but the main features of this proposal is that it's not really just reconstructing the port as it is to make it a functioning port and restore areas around it like in a basic way. So it's more of an active kind of project that wants to shift the whole port to the east. Okay, so the current area where the containers are, etc., will be all shifted to the east, more towards Burj Hammoud as we know it now, and the area that is currently where most of the port activities happen was assessed by the consultants who did this to be by the experts to be not very efficient as a port area, which is why it will be transformed into something like development, like a real estate development project. It sounds a bit like any reconstruction project where you see all these green areas and these buildings and community centers in the plan. So it made a lot of people think, is this just another Solidar happening here? Which is always the question in Lebanon because of the terrible experience that we had with the Solidar as a project. But just to give a few things, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a future episode. Just to give it a few like info about it, the proposal that was circulated around, the ones that probably many people listening to this received it on WhatsApp, etc. It said that the timeline for this project would be 15 to 20 years. The port would be used again, like the new port would be utilized starting in 2030. 5 years earlier, the building starts. So the first 4 years would be just for planning and fixing the grounds for, like preparing the grounds for the project, getting the permits and everything. And it says also that the budget of the project would be $7 billion in investment, and that it would generate $2.5 billion in profit, of direct profit basically. And they projected $30 billion of so, but this is a very like wild estimation over the next 25 years, and that it would create 50,000 permanent jobs. So these are the basic lines of the proposals. I don't know if you guys want to add anything, but I think this is kind of like the basics of it. But obviously, this doesn't mean that it's going to be approved as it is or approved at all, because we're still getting different talks of a French company like CMA CGM, which is owned by a Lebanese French company, has already mentioned that they are interested to reconstruct the port for almost nothing. I don't know how, but like for hundreds of millions of dollars, and restore its functions much faster. But we have this much more drastic proposal, and we'll see much maybe other proposals being offered in the near future.
Yeah, everybody was talking about this this week, but it's you have to remember this is so early. We're just in the beginning stages of this. This is just a proposal. And also, whenever you see one of these proposals, at least for me, something that costs billions and billions of dollars to do long-term planning, and also just a lot of reforms that have to happen in order for this investment to come in, and then you see the end product with it actually looks quite cool if you look at the proposal that they have. They've got all these parks, and it's this residential commercial zone and everything like that. I mean, it looks very, very nice on paper, but then you see what all would have to happen in order for this to actually come to fruition, and you think, oh, I mean, this is a dream. This is very unlikely to happen in this way on the timeline that they have put forward. It just seems that the number of things that would have to happen, especially with the reforms that would have to happen in order to get the investment. I mean, that is a major ask, and I don't know of a case where really that's happened in the past. So to me, this all just seems sort of like a nice proposal, It would be great if it actually did happen, but very unlikely to happen, at least on the time scale that they've proposed. And speaking of transparency and reforms that are needed in Lebanon, moving on to another topic is what's going on at BDL right now. This week we had a lot of movement on the audit. The audit is one of those things that we kind of thought was dead because the firm that was conducting it, Alvarez and Marcel, pulled out last year after BDL failed to cooperate with them. But this week on Tuesday, there was a big meeting with BDL representatives, Ministry of Finance, Alvarez and Marcel, lawyers. And supposedly what happened at this meeting, BDL agreed to give information over. On Friday, BDL announced that it actually did hand an updated list of information to the finance ministry. I'm still a little bit unclear what exactly this contains. What it was the actual information that A&M wanted or needed in order to conduct the forensic audit, or was it just a list of things, or what exactly? So we're still waiting to get visibility on that, but it seems as though the audit is not dead. It seems as though it is possible to revive the audit, and there has been movement. So this week and in the coming weeks, we're going to be keeping an eye out, trying to figure out, exactly what's going on with that and whether there's more movement on that. And all of this comes amid, as BDL it is facing a lot of challenges on a lot of different fronts. This week, it emerged that foreign banks are cutting ties with Lebanon's financial system. So it was reported that BDL had sent a letter to the public prosecutor in which Riyad Salemi had said that HSBC and Wells Fargo, among other banks, had closed accounts at BDL, which is it's another sign that what we know as the financial crisis is not something that is just over, or we haven't reached the bottom. It can get worse, and it seems as though it is getting worse. Also, we know that the foreign currency reserves at BDL continue to run low, and this week again we got more warnings about that. It seems to me as though the subsidies program that BDL runs with its foreign currency, it's always like, oh, we've got a couple more months of subsidies left. But on the other hand, we keep getting this information as well that BDL seems to be delaying payments. So we have all of these issues with medical importers, for instance, not being able to process the payments to import medical equipment. Also, gasoline providers being unable to import gasoline so that people can buy fuel at the pumps. And we have seen this over the past week with, gas stations running out of gas and lines forming outside of gas stations. And this time, the gas station owners and fuel distributors are warning this problem might not go away because we're having major issues with getting BDL to clear our payments and use up their dwindling foreign currency reserves. And so on this front as well, we are seeing that, oh no, the financial crisis that Lebanon has been experiencing for the past year and a half, it's not over, and it seems like it's just going to get worse. We are headed for worse times ahead. And finally, cabinet formation. As of today, when you're listening to this Monday, it has been 245 days. Lebanon has not had a government, and it has been 172 days since Hariri was designated to form a new government. This week, there was not a lot of actual movement. We did have visits from the Assistant Secretary General of the Arab League. We had a visit from the Egyptian Foreign Minister. There seems to be quite a bit of international activity going on, but just in terms of local progress, everything is still at a standstill. We still don't even have clarity on the number of ministers, which tells you that things are still kind of early, it seems, despite the fact that we are months and months into this process.
And why the rush, right, Ben? I mean, there's nothing urgent to deal with here, so they can take their time. It's becoming a little bit surreal, right? It's becoming a bit like as if these people are completely divorced from what's happening here. Like, months and months pass without anything happening. Anyway, I think enough with the depressing news for this episode. We can move now to our main topic, which is media. And not just media in general, including all sorts of media. We're talking more about political media, about journalism and news journalism. And it's really great to have you here, Jean, with us today because on the local media sphere in Lebanon, one of the most interesting, most remarkable new ventures in the last few years has been Megaphone, which I let you introduce. Actually, people can find their outlets online, but I let you introduce the idea behind it because we're going to be coming back to it at some point during this discussion.
Thank you guys for having me. So basically, Megaphone was created in the summer of 2017. And I mean, the rationale behind it was to both have a platform that's able to talk about progressive issues and also be extremely critical of the entire establishment, both the political establishment, but also the economic system. And I mean, name things without sugarcoating, but also talk about issues and shed light on stories that don't really have their place in traditional media, and mainly the issues and stories of the most marginalized groups. So that's, if you want, on the editorial side. And in terms of the format itself, it was an attempt to do something a bit more innovative at a time where the media landscape wasn't really adapting to the digital age. So the formats were quite obsolete, and it had created some sort of a detachment with a big segment of society, mostly young people, who were no longer following traditional media. So that was sort of the rationale in 2017, and it started off as a purely volunteer-based project. And with time, it sort of institutionalized, and now today, it's I mean, after the uprising, it took a whole other dimension, and now it's becoming more of a sort of a daily platform that produces and comments on news on a daily basis.
And you created Megaphone, you co-founded Megaphone at a time when the Lebanese media was very much, I guess you could say, owned by certain interests that were either political, had a lot of political power or a lot of financial power. And if you look at the evidence, you can see this, right? So the Jean Kassir Foundation, for instance, and Reporters Without Borders did a big project a couple of years ago to track who actually owns the media outlets in the country. And if you go through their website, they put all of the stuff online. You can see that, in fact, that's true. Like if you look at the owners of media outlets, a lot of times they're names that or they're associated with certain political or financial interests that and so within all of this, you started Megaphone, which is not it's sort of the opposite of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And if you want, beyond that structural issue of ownership, but also of licenses that were distributed in the 90s for TVs and that were totally affiliated to political groups, there's an episode that happened in 2015 during the protest movement from which we learned a lot of lessons, which is that there are structural barriers when it comes to that traditional media landscape that can't really accompany this protest movement, because there were attempts back then to put a camera live on the street and then also to echo some of the demands of the people, and to even host shows that were going in line with that direction. And we noticed that very, very soon this stopped happening, and it was also driven by political and financial considerations. And then right after, we had the 2018 elections episode, where it was just obvious that political money was interfering, and media platforms were able to monetize spots on their main shows, and also it led to a big issue of misrepresentation or lack of representation, actually, of the opposition group back then. So it was in this this context that for us it was clear that there wasn't a possibility to rely or depend on this traditional media structure to be able to make any breakthrough. So that was also one of the rationale that pushed us to first go on social media, because we saw that there was an opportunity there, and to really try to create an alternative platform to these traditional media platforms.
Yeah, and if we're just gonna be like trying to describe what's really wrong with the media sector in Lebanon, like you have issues that are very clear, like the excessive reliance on sensationalism for everything, from politics to celebrity news to everything in between. The poor professional standards, when you look at the products of most newspapers, most TV stations, you watch the news, you don't find any, a lot of, craft journalism in there. So there are problems like professional. There are problems that are related to style and to the way that they try to attract viewers and readers, etc. But you also have things that are much more structural, like business ownership, like political agenda, like overwhelming racist or classist attitudes, conservative approach to things, that always kind of looking with surprise at anything that's trying to challenge the status quo, or reproducing the same kind of hegemonic culture that exists. And when it comes to these last challenges, I think what you were talking about in terms of the need to create a new media institution probably comes because of these latter, much more fundamental, much more like much stronger challenges, which is basically that you can never trust that the media will be on your side if it has a political agenda, or if its business model is dependent on people in the political establishment that you are actively, you are active against, basically. Is that kind of how you see it as well?
No, I mean, absolutely. And we can fairly say that the traditional media landscape in Lebanon really emulates the power structure in society, be it in its patriarchal form, the racist form, also this idea of sort of politeness, and this entire policing that is happening when people express themselves on media. And I mean, we've seen an episode of that during the uprising in 2019, where reporters were actively trying to shut up people who were cursing. So this entire power structure and sort of moral, quote unquote, structure that is constantly reproduced and emulated by these platforms to maintain also the current order in shape. And you also mentioned something extremely important, which is the sensationalism. And we have a lot of episodes that are, I mean, really dramatic in that regard. One of them is what happened with Ziad Aiteni. And also the link between the media platforms and the mukhabarat and the different security services, which completely, cancels the idea of justice. So justice is happening on these platforms and based on political agenda and so on. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of issues. It's also important to acknowledge that there is some very good journalistic work being done by journalists on those platforms. The investigative level, as we've seen recently with the port explosion. But of course, there are structural issues that don't allow, these journalists, in my opinion, to be completely free in these platforms. And these are related to the fact that, of course, the ownership and the political agendas of these platforms, and also the fact that these platforms, in a sense, are constantly in a trading game with the political establishment for the ones that are not complete mouthpieces of the political establishment. So they sometimes allow for criticism in return of something else, or on the contrary, they go into very clear whitewashing campaigns, like what happened when Basile was hosted a few weeks after the uprising. So we see that game constantly happening between, on the one hand, sort of the stick and the carrot, in a sense. So yeah, I would say that there's always some room for pluralism and critical journalism being done on these platforms, but within very clear limits.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at, just sort of like think of it in terms of interests, right? Because you do have, very, very good journalists working in a lot of different media institutions in the country, and a lot of times, like they try to do as much as they can within the bounds, sort of what they're allowed to do. But sometimes those bounds change, right? And so, like, for instance, you hear about certain newspapers or certain media organizations that will, for instance, allow criticism of the banks every so often. The banks are, the the big advertisers, or at least up until recently they were. So they're a great source of revenue for a lot of these media outlets. And so there is this at least suggestion that what happens sometimes is, or what has happened sometimes in the past, is that certain media outlets would allow criticism of the banks and to use as a negotiating tactic so that the banks would buy more ads in their newspapers, for instance.
Yeah, I mean that's obviously a very plausible reading of the relationship between the media sector and other sectors like the banks. But beyond that point, I think it's also worth discussing a bit the financial crisis that media faces, not just here but globally. I mean, here there was a lot of political money that's no longer as available as it used to be, and obviously the advertising money is much less than it used to be. We're seeing a real crisis when it comes to traditional media. And then on the other hand, the emerging alternative sort of media platforms are also relying on models that are not extremely sustainable. So one of them is to rely on grants and support and donations, which in a sense also is limited and still constitutes a structural barrier for the growth of these platforms. And obviously, it's very hard to think of putting a paywall because of the abundance of free content that's available in the country and in the region. And also for the socio-economic situation that doesn't allow really people to be able to contribute like it's being done elsewhere. So I think constantly, I mean, with our colleagues from other platforms, there is a constant conversation about ways to monetize without obviously compromising any of the integrity of the project, and while at the same time maintaining the content free and accessible for everyone. And there are a lot of avenues being discussed. One of them are donations and support and the idea of membership. Others are the idea of producing services and also selling some of the services. So it's interesting to see that this is a conversation that is happening, and we're also seeing some models that are trying to emerge in that regard to keep our platforms free and sustainable.
So basically, the main purpose here will be to create a business model that does not affect the institution editorially. It doesn't affect what you focus, what you cover, and how critical you are of anyone or anything. At the same time, having like a valid stream of revenues, because it's like, as you were saying before, currently with the media sector in Lebanon, it's a matter of trade. It's a matter of like commodifying your work to sell it to the establishment, being banks or politicians, etc. Be it your good work, their good journalistic work, where you are critical of them, or just praising them when needed, etc. So, like what I understand from you is that it's basically quite the opposite, trying to divorce these two aspects and move and think of ownership and funding and all of that away from the distortions of the current media landscape.
No, absolutely. I mean, for us, from the early days, the intent was to be able to create a platform that's mainstream and that's not elitist and just limited to a very small crowd. And that's something that also needs funds to be able to expand and to be able to really produce abundantly and to keep the same quality of the work. So the obvious option for us in the beginning was to seek grants, and obviously grants that do not interfere editorially or impose any editorial conditions. But the entire grant model is not really adapted to media, except a few exceptions of foundations that really provide flexible and long-term funding, in the sense that the grants have been designed for NGOs in a very project-based mentality, which is not quite adapted to the dynamic work of media platforms. So beyond that, now we're trying to develop models that allow for a revenue stream that's much more flexible to come in, and to be able accordingly to further expand our work.
And just to piggyback on that, and as a bit of transparency on our part, in case you don't know, I'm the managing editor of L'Orient Today, the sister publication of L'Orient Le Jour, and that's exactly what we're trying to do as well. We're trying to make a subscription model happen so that we can free ourselves from any sort of potential political or financial interference funding wise. And so what we hope to be able to show is that no, you actually can do this. You can move to a different model where these political and financial interests no longer have a say editorially, and there are no longer, if you've worked in media for a while in this country, you may know that a lot of times you don't get necessarily a directive from above that, oh no, you need to toe this line, this editorial line or whatever, but you sort of know where the boundaries are, right? Based on the ownership of the company, whoever is involved in the management. And so if you then are able to free yourself from this, though, then that would give the journalists even more freedom to be critical, to bring out the stories that they see as important for the public to know, and to really, I guess, serve the readers or serve your viewers in a way that is a lot better, a lot more useful for them to know what's going on in the country. And it seems like at Megaphone, you're doing the same kinds of things. The rule number one is let's not allow any sort of potential conflict of interest in regarding funding or ownership or control. Is that accurate?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the defining features of the model altogether. But there's also another defining feature, which is the sort of collective aspect of first creating that editorial line, but also creating every piece that gets out and that's not signed, like the opinion articles. So that's also quite a challenging process, because at the end, it's all signed with this logo, Megaphone. So there needs to be a constant conversation with the team to be able to develop that piece. And I think that's also what makes it work, in a sense, because there are so many people from different disciplines and from different walks of lives and perspectives and trainings that are able to put input in each of the pieces. And
I want to go back to something you said, speaking of the editorial line, etc. I want to go back to one of the first things you said when I asked you about Megaphone, and it was, you think of it as a progressive voice. Am I right? It's political, and it's a political project as much as it's a journalistic project, or it has a political agenda that is not. It's not like a political party or anything, or not seeking to be maybe mobilizing for one entity, but it has certain principles and certain values, and it's not trying to be impartial, in at least in the battle between the people who are against the political establishment in Lebanon and against the business establishment as well, and those of the ruling establishment, right? In terms of social movements, in terms of protest movements, this is where Megaphone kind of excels usually, by being critical of the establishment forces. So what do you think about, not you, maybe you as Jean as well, but you as Megaphone as a project, what do you think of about this question of impartiality and the question of journalism and activism?
I mean, first, the question of impartiality / neutrality in journalism, we simply think it doesn't exist. And it's quite dangerous when people are claiming that they are. Because, I mean, everything is ideological, from the words and terminologies we use to the angles we adopt to even the stories we decide to pick up and so on. So from that basic baseline, if you want, and reading of how things happen already in journalism, we are not shying away from our editorial line, which is quite political and very clear. But that's not militant, or that's not, if you want, driven in an activism logic. We think that today there's an extremely violent struggle, even if that violence expresses itself in the economy, in the racist and patriarchal nature of the system, through the repression on free speech in the country. But that's really a battle, and that's a violent battle. And it's also a battle that's not being done with equal means. So we have an entire media landscape today that is dominated by both the political and the economic structures in the country. And there's our platform that's trying to provide a counter discourse to debunk the hegemonic discourse, and to also open, if you want, the room for dissident voices to express themselves. So we're not going to share that small platform with the establishment to provide sort of like an illusion of the two sides of the story, because the other side of the story is overwhelmingly present. I mean, everywhere. But that doesn't mean that we don't abide by very strict professional standards that have to do with verifying information, also the way we frame that information and we construct it, and also obviously in case there is any issue or any mistake, to be able to correct it and to be transparent about that. So that's for us something that we abide by, which are the basics of our profession. But we don't sell that Megaphone is some sort of a neutral platform. That's not the purpose.
And I mean, also the whole concept, though, of journalistic neutrality, that's been largely discredited, especially over the past decade or so, not just here in Lebanon, but around the globe, right? There, you know, if you're a reporter and you are working on some story, you know the ins and outs of it, some political story, you're going to form an opinion naturally. We're all human, and especially once we become sort of subject matter experts in something, you're going to naturally have some opinion about that based on what you've seen and your own ideological predispositions, and that's going to come through in your reporting. And so I think that there's been a movement to be at least a little bit more honest about this in general, globally within news organizations, of recognizing that everybody has biases. We're coming at this from a certain, political standpoint or ideological standpoint that may be partially unconscious on our part. So we should at least be a little bit more honest about where we're coming from, and at least not pretend that we are just like this entity that is somehow separated from human society, and we're like scientists studying people and we're totally unbiased and have, don't have our own connections or interests here.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you in terms of like that objectivity and impartiality is a lie. To me, it's all about framing. That's really what it's about. Because when you're reading a piece of news, let's talk about news for a second. When you're reading a piece of news, when you read the lead of it, like just the main story, it's usually almost identical across most news stations, and then or news outlets. And then when you read the context that they give, the context changes everything. If they give context, and here we go back to the poor professional standards that we're usually reading news stories in Lebanon, really, with the exception of a few media outlets, including L'Orient Today, including the Daily Star. And I'm not only talking about English outlets, I'm talking about almost all newspapers, all Arabic newspapers. No one gives you context except for when they are providing you with like large-scale analysis, narrative analysis, etc. But when you look at, for example, this is one of the most interesting things to me in Megaphone's news coverage, is that you guys put the news and then and kind of another paragraph in a Facebook post, for instance, or a tweet or whatever. You put the piece of news, one line, and then the second paragraph is always kind of reminding us of something, like putting this news in the context of things that have happened previously. And this is where the politics come in. And I think, John, you will agree with me that the context that you give, for example, when someone says, give me this ministry and I will fix things, and the context says his party has the ministry for 10 years before and they never did this or whatever, or anything that shows a contradiction between what a politician is saying and what the record shows, is clearly a context that is given to be critical, to encourage people to be critical. Am I wrong?
No, I mean, I totally agree. That's the point. For us, we're not competing over breaking news at Megaphone, obviously because we don't have the means to do so, but because we're not also interested. We think that the piece of information, sort of the factual piece of information, will get across. And what we can do, and our input here is the framing and the backstory and the context and all of that. So that's what we're really focusing on. Because also, I mean, there's a lot of sort of selective memory when it comes to news, and it's very hard also to remember the entire backstory and context all the time. So we think that, I mean, really the main added value that we can provide here is providing that, and we also complement that through longer pieces, through the videos that also dig deeper into some of the patterns of politics, some of the structural issues, and that sort of complement our news coverage.
Yeah, and I think that there's a huge hunger as well for context, and I think we've seen that. Yeah, I mean, obviously you see that at Megaphone, we've seen that at Lorient today. We've seen that here with our podcast. You know, people really like it when you don't just give them, oh, X, Y, and Z happened, but then you go just, even if it's a couple months back, you know, and add in just a bit of context to let people, you know, remind people that this happened in the past. And so, and then they can make their own judgments as to what they think the news of the day means, and how important it is and how impactful it possibly could be.
And another thing we are very hungry for is things that explain, right? Journalism that explains things to us. Because even people who are, great journalists, they reveal important things to us. They have good analysis, etc. When you don't explain it to people, I don't know how much influence you are having on the massive scale. And I also, as I've also noticed this in Megaphone's journey so far, that they are increasingly focusing on explaining certain things, especially in the economic sphere, where basically people haven't been politicized much in the past. Like since the beginning of the financial collapse, people have been looking at the economy and at finance from a much more critical perspective and political perspective than before. Before that, if you went on TV and said, Marcel Ghanem is in bed with Riyad Salami, people wouldn't care because Riyad Salami wasn't a controversial figure, or anyone who has relationships to the banking establishment wouldn't be controversial for that fact. But this completely changed afterwards. Similarly, in other economic affairs that people are much more interested in now that there's this crisis. So what's your vision in terms of Megaphone team for making the news more and more accessible to people?
I mean, when we started off more as sort of a magazine, so we weren't really into the hot news cycle, and we used to produce on a weekly and monthly basis. And these pieces were pretty much sort of explainer pieces, in the sense that the idea was to really break down complex notions and to make them accessible so that people would feel much more comfortable getting into the public debate and taking part in it. So that was the bet. And I think it functioned quite well. And there was, as you said, a hunger for more of that. When it comes to the economic coverage, again, I mean, we, like many others, saw the signs of that collapse, which was sort of announced by a lot of economists and a lot of observers. And for us, it was imperative to move the economic conversation away from the technicalities and politicize it and simplify it and make it about people's lives. And that was basically the point of this series of explainer videos that we produced around the economy. And we can say that both, I mean, our work and everyone else in the media landscape who's been doing similar efforts, in a sense, have contributed to creating that awareness on economic notions, even mainstreamizing terms like the idea of capital control and so on and so forth. And really, I mean, sort of empowering the audience with the necessary toolbox to not only take an active part in the debate, but also be able to form their own opinion and know where they stand in terms of their own interest in that in that battle. I mean, down the line, obviously, we want to do more of that. So that explainer content, because obviously since the uprising, we've taken more of a day-to-day approach, and we moved away a bit from the magazine-ish approach. So now we're trying to balance out both. So to be able to be both present on the immediate reading of the news and framing of the news, but also to unpack more structural topics and conversations.
And zooming out to the larger media landscape here in Lebanon, do you feel as though since the uprising, since the financial crisis, do you feel as though the media has been more willing to offer that greater context, more willing maybe to offer critiques of the financial system, of the political system, etc., or do you see it sort of as more of the same?
I mean, if we're talking about traditional media, I do think that they had to adapt for all sorts of considerations. One of them catering to the audience needs and to what the audience wants to know about and hear. But I mean, beyond that point, what's really encouraging is this parallel media infrastructure that is emerging after the uprising. And it's important to say that we were quite late in Lebanon to do that digital transformation in a sense. And it happened much earlier, around 2011, around Arab uprisings in other countries like Egypt, like Syria, Tunisia. But we were a bit late to be able to create platforms that really constitute an alternative and that are able to mainstreamize, in a sense, an alternative voice. But I think we are almost there. There's a lot of platforms emerging, and they are creating a parallel ecosystem to the traditional media platform. And I think that this is here to stay and to further develop. Every once in a while, we hear of a new podcast, a new initiative, a new social media account that is producing content that's political or economic or feminist content or all sorts of different contents. And yeah, I mean, that is going in the right direction, and it's extremely encouraging.
It seems to me that we pass through cycles with in terms of our relationship with the national media, with the traditional media in Lebanon. During elections, for example, it's clear that they are on the side of whoever pays most for appearing on their stations. But during uprising moments such as the 2019 uprising, we see that the media is suddenly very interested in us because that's what people are interested in, and this is what also is commercially viable and what's like overwhelmingly there in the country. And then they start slowly, as the movement fades, as the momentum fades, they start slowly going back to their old habits of hosting the same old people to provide the same old talking points or whatever new talking points they come up with, but on behalf of ruling parties and the ruling business interests in the country. So it's I think now we're at this point where basically we it feels like we're back at square one, where the same old faces are everywhere, except that there was some undeniable impact, as you were saying, John, from the uprising, from other things that happened. I think the port explosion as well, that kind of will just be there because they have influenced so many human beings inside these institutions, that the counter hegemonic discourse that Megaphone or other independent voices provide is there somewhere. So inside the establishment, inside the media establishment, as in Lebanon today, there are so many kind of free or independent voices that are much more, can be heard much more than before. But also the overall standards for what is acceptable to say or what to do in terms of media institution have kind of shifted, even if not radically, right?
No, I mean, absolutely. And that's also what is encouraging, is it says that we are influencing the traditional media, whether they like it or not. They will have to adapt to the new rules of the game and the new way journalism is being done, because all those emerging platforms are successful and, I mean, are receiving a lot of traction, especially from young people. So in terms of if only marketing and commercial and factors have to do with the industry itself and its transformation and its transitions, I think that the traditional media will have to adapt. And we've already seen some signs of this adaptation.
Yeah, I want to quickly just note, a lot of this new media, it comes because of technology, because of the internet, right? There are very, very strict laws and rules about like who can set up a newspaper, who can set up a radio station. You have to get the licensing and all of this stuff. All of this stuff is quite heavily regulated in Lebanon, even till today, right? But the internet is sort of the Wild West, right? There aren't as many restrictions, which allows for a lot greater, I guess, freedom for these new outlets, yours included, to spring up and get quite a bit of traction and say things that aren't being said in the traditional media sphere. But along with that as well comes a difference in the protections offered for this potentially. And so you have sort of legal consequences and consequences for just like the workers as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, at the legal level, if you want this entire digital media ecosystem is in the gray zone, in the sense that we still don't know which law applies to it, if it's the publications law, which provide a bit more protection than the other general law when it comes to speech. And obviously, there's the huge issue of the syndicate and the inability to access that union that is completely hijacked by political forces. And we've seen the emergence of this alternative union of journalists since the uprising to compensate that. But the final thing I'd like to maybe add to the conversation when it comes to also portraying social media as a free platform, in a sense, has nothing to do with the Lebanese government here. It has to do with the platforms on which we exist, which are Facebook and Instagram, which aren't very much adapted to digital political content in Arabic. And we've seen a lot of cases of our content and other platforms' content being taken down because the algorithm is not really adapted to that. Not to mention the entire structure and extremely, capitalistic nature of those platforms, which rely a lot on ads and don't really promote a lot the organic content. So there are also structural issues when it comes to the platforms themselves that we're using. But we've decided to play that game because we are obviously restricted in our options, and also because we want to reach the biggest amount of people.
And all of these factors sort of, at least for me, play into what I think is like the biggest overarching question. And to me, that relates to the purpose of journalism in the first place. For me, at least, the entire enterprise is about sort of regulating the flow of information, ensuring that nobody who is very powerful is able to have control of information, because at the end of the day, if somebody has a lot of power, one of the ways that they use to maintain that power and increase that power is by controlling information, by controlling stories that maybe don't look so good about them. And to me, the fundamental point of journalism is to wrest control of that information away from those with lots and lots of power, so that you can inform the public in a much more useful way. If that is the point of journalism, the question then becomes, well, what are the chances for these new media outlets and old media outlets to do this more effectively? Are they better positioned now to fulfill the essential purpose of journalism?
I'm quite skeptical about that because I don't think that they really abide by the notion of journalism that you just explained, and they're driven by either commercial or real political motives. But what I'm sure of, and I'm pretty sure that this will happen, is that they will have to adapt when it comes to the form and also possibly to the content to the new reality that we're facing. But I do think that, I do hope also that it's up to the digital, non-conventional, alternative media that's emerging to really be able to, set the trend down the line, and hopefully reach the point where it can actually become the go-to source of information.
Totally. I totally agree with you, and thank you again, John, for coming on this episode, sharing so many insights. I think the conversation around media and journalism is one that we should never stop having. From the purpose of journalism itself, as Ben was saying, to the little details of how platforms change, the tools we use, and the content and everything. Anyway, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both for having me.
It's a pleasure. We'll be back with another episode of the Lebanese Politics Podcast next week. Until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Benjamin Redd.
I'm Jean Kassir.
This has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast. The Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Redd, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.